What if the life you built was a lie, and the family you left behind held the key to your redemption? Welcome to the garden under moonlight, where secrets bloom like roses and forgiveness grows in the hardest hearts. Join Isabelle Laurent as she unravels a hidden truth under the starlit cliffs of Côte d'Azur, a truth that could shatter her empire or heal her soul. Will she find her way home, or lose everything to the past? Dive into this journey of love, loss, and second chances, and let it touch your heart. If you're captivated, hit that like button and subscribe to follow every twist and turn. New chapters drop regularly, and you won't want to miss a single petal of this story. The wind swept down the cliffs of Côte d'Azur, carrying the sharp tang of salt and the faint sweetness of lavender. Isabelle Laurent stood at the edge of her mother's garden, her silk dress fluttering against the wild roses that spilled over the stone path. The villa behind her loomed like a polished jewel, its marble columns catching the last rays of the sun. From Paris to Milan, her name was synonymous with haute couture, her designs draping royalty and lighting up runways. But here, in this quiet corner of southern France, she was just a daughter who'd stayed away too long. In her hand, she clutched a faded silk scarf, its edges frayed from years of neglect. The embroidery, "You are always home," gleamed faintly. Under the dusk's soft light, each stitch a reminder of the mother she'd left behind. Isabelle's fingers tightened around it, her manicured nails pressing into her palm. 20 years ago, she'd walked away from Eleanor, her mother's. Quiet pleas drowned out by the roar of ambition. Paris had called, promising power, glamour, a way to bury the sting of a lover's betrayal. She'd answered, and she hadn't looked back. Until now. The letter had arrived a week ago, its words stark and unyielding. "Your mother's heart is failing. She asks for you." Isabelle had stared at it, her coffee growing cold on her desk overlooking the Seine. She'd built an empire, her gowns worn by queens, her name a fortress. Yet the thought of facing Eleanor cracked something inside her, something she'd spent decades sealing shut. What could she say? That she'd been wrong? That the lover who'd shattered her had turned her heart to stone, made her choose runways over family? A rustle broke her thoughts. From the tangle of roses, a young woman emerged, her hands dusted with soil. She was no older than 18, her linen dress smudged with earth, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, met Isabelle's with a quiet defiance that made her breath catch. "You must be Isabelle," the girl said, wiping her hands on her apron. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Eleanor said you might come." Isabelle straightened, her tone cool, practiced. "And you are?" "Sophie." The girl's gaze flicked to the scarf, then back to Isabelle's face. "I help with the garden. She's inside if you're ready." "Ready?" Isabelle almost laughed. She hadn't been ready for 20 years. Her heels sank slightly into the soft earth as she followed Sophie toward the stone cottage at the garden's edge. The villa was hers. She'd bought it for Eleanor a decade ago, a grand gesture that felt hollow now. But the cottage was her mother's sanctuary, small and stubborn, like the woman who lived there. Inside, the air smelled of chamomile and weathered books. Eleanor sat by the window, her silver hair catching the fading light. She looked smaller than Isabelle remembered, her hands folded over a quilt, but her eyes, those piercing, knowing eyes, hadn't dimmed. They locked onto Isabelle, stripping away the years, the success, the armor. "Isabelle," Eleanor said, her voice soft but steady, like the tide beyond the cliffs. "You came." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken decades. Isabelle's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to bridge the chasm, but her lips betrayed her. What could she say to a mother she'd abandoned? She settled for a nod, her fingers curling around the scarf in her pocket. "I heard you're not well," she said finally, the words stiff, rehearsed. "I wanted to see you." Eleanor's lips curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to sting. "The doctors fuss too much. Sit, child. Child." The word cut deeper than Isabel expected, a reminder of the girl she'd buried under silk and ambition. She sat, her gaze drifting to Sophie, who lingered by the door, her hands clasped tightly. There was something familiar in the girl's features, the curve of her jaw, the way she stood, poised yet guarded. Isabel pushed the thought aside. She was imagining things, seeing ghosts where there were none. They spoke of small things, the roses, the town, the sea's endless song. But every pause carried the weight of their last fight, when Isabel had screamed that she didn't need anyone, that Paris was her future. She'd been 27, raw from a lover's betrayal, and Eleanor's quiet plea to stay had felt like a chain. She'd torn free, and the silence that followed had stretched across 2 decades. As the dusk deepened, Sophie stepped outside to fetch a watering can. The scarf slipped from Isabel's lap, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. Sophie bent to pick it up, her fingers brushing the embroidered words. "It's beautiful," Sophie said, her voice softer now, almost reverent. "Eleanor, has one like it?" Isabel's chest tightened. "It's hers. Was hers." She reached for it too sharply, and Sophie flinched, handing it back with a guarded look. "Sorry," Sophie muttered, stepping back. Isabel clutched the scarf. Shame, curling in her gut like smoke. Why had she snapped? The girl was nothing to her, just a gardener, a stranger. Yet something in Sophie's eyes, in the way she moved, stirred a memory Isabel couldn't grasp, like a melody half forgotten. She pressed the scarf to her palm, its softness a rebuke. Eleanor watched them, her expression unreadable, like the sea before a storm. "You've traveled far, Isabel," she said. "Rest tonight. We have time." Time. The word felt like a lie, fragile as the roses outside. Isabel nodded, stepping into the garden as Sophie disappeared into the cottage. The lavender glowed under the first stars, its scent mingling with the salt air. She stood alone, the scarf warm in her hand, the villa's lights casting long shadows across the lawn. She'd come to make amends, to say the words she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. But what if she'd forgotten how to feel? What if the woman who'd conquered Paris had nothing left to give? The wind whispered through the roses, carrying no answers, only the weight of a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The morning. Sun spilled over Côte d'Azur, painting the villa's white walls with a golden sheen, but the air carried a chill that lingered from the night. Isabelle Laurent stood on the terrace, her coffee untouched, the silk scarf draped loosely around her shoulders. Its embroidered words, "You are always home," felt like a weight, pressing against the hollow ache in her chest. She'd slept poorly, her dreams tangled with Eleanor's voice, sharp and pleading, from that final fight 20 years ago. "Stay, Isabelle. You don't have to run." But she had run. To Paris. To power. To a life that gleamed but never warmed. Below, the garden stretched, toward the sea, its lavender and roses swaying in the breeze. Sophie was there, kneeling among the flowers, her hands deft as she pruned the overgrown stems. Isabel watched her, searching for something she couldn't name. The girl's presence gnawed at her, stirring a restlessness she hadn't felt in years. Who was Sophie, really? A gardener, Eleanor had said, but the way she moved, the way her eyes held Eleanor's same quiet strength, felt too familiar, too close. The villa was too grand for Isabel's taste. She'd bought it on a whim, a hollow apology for years of silence. But she'd settled into a guest room for now, unable to face Paris just yet. Eleanor's cottage, small and stubborn, stood at the garden's edge, a reminder of the mother who'd never needed her wealth. Isabel's phone buzzed, shattering the stillness. A message from her assistant in Paris. "Antoine Dubois is sniffing around. Rumors about your hiatus. Call me. Antoine." The name twisted like a knife. A rival designer, once her equal. He'd never forgiven her for outshining him at a Milan show a decade ago. She'd played hard, maybe too hard, and his career had faltered, while hers soared. Now, with her absence from Paris, he smelled blood. Isabel's jaw tightened. She'd built her empire on instinct, on never blinking first. But standing here, with Eleanor's scarf around her, Paris felt like another world, one she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. She descended the stone steps to the garden, her heels clicking softly. Sophie glanced up, her hands pausing mid-snip. "Morning," she said, her tone neutral, but her eyes lingered on the scarf. "Morning," Isabel replied, forcing a smile. She gestured to the roses. "They're beautiful. You've got a gift." Sophie shrugged, brushing dirt from her palms. "Eleanor taught me. She says flowers listen if you're patient." The words stung, though Isabel couldn't say why. She knelt beside Sophie, her silk skirt grazing the earth. "Can I help?" she asked, the question surprising even herself. Sophie handed her a pair of shears, her expression unreadable. They worked in silence, the snip of blades mingling with the distant crash of waves. Isabel's hands fumbled, unaccustomed to anything so raw, so alive. A thorn pricked her finger, and she winced, a bead of blood welling up. Sophie's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Careful," she said. "They bite." Isabel laughed, a sound that felt foreign in her throat. For a moment, the garden held them, two strangers bound by roses in sunlight. But the ease vanished when Sophie's sleeve slipped, revealing a silver bracelet engraved with a name. Claire. Isabel froze. Claire, her sister, gone 10 years now, her death a wound she'd never faced. The bracelet was Eleanor's, one Claire had worn as a girl. Why did Sophie have it? "Nice bracelet," Isabel said, her voice too tight. "Where'd you get it?" Sophie's hand covered it, quick as a reflex. "It was a gift," she said, standing abruptly. "I should check on Eleanor." She was gone before Isabel could press further, leaving the shears in the dirt. Isabel's pulse quickened. Claire's name echoed in her mind, dragging up memories she'd buried. Her sister's laugh, her quiet pleas for Isabel to stay after their father died. Isabel had left anyway, chasing Paris, leaving Claire and Eleanor to pick up the pieces. Guilt curled in her gut, sharp as the thorn's sting. Inside the cottage, Eleanor sat at a wooden table, a cup of chamomile steaming in her hands. Sophie was nowhere in sight. Isabel hesitated, the scarf heavy in her pocket. "She's dedicated," she said, nodding toward the garden. "Sophie, I mean." Eleanor's eyes softened. "She's been a blessing. Keeps the roses alive. Keeps me company." "How long has she been here?" Isabel asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Eleanor's gaze flickered, just for a moment. "A while," she said, sipping her tea. "She needed a home. I had one to give." The vagueness pricked at Isabel, but she let it go. She sat across from Eleanor, searching her mother's face for answers. The silence stretched, heavy with all they hadn't said. "I'm sorry," Isabel blurted, the words raw, unplanned. "For staying away. I didn't know how to come back." Eleanor reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly. "You're here now," she said, her voice a lifeline. "That's enough for today." But it wasn't enough, not for Isabel. The bracelet, Sophie's familiarity, Eleanor's guarded words, they churned in her mind, pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet see. Her phone buzzed again, a voicemail this time. She ignored it, but the name Antoine flashed in her thoughts, a shadow circling closer. Later, alone in the villa, Isabel wandered into Eleanor's study, drawn by a need she couldn't name. The room was cluttered with books and sketches, relics of a life she'd never shared. On the desk sat an old photo half hidden under papers. Claire, smiling, holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. Isabel's breath caught. The baby's eyes, even in the faded image, were unmistakable. Sophie's eyes. Her hands shook as she clutched the scarf, its stitches pressing into her skin. Who was Sophie really? And what had Eleanor kept from her all these years? Outside, the garden lay quiet, its secrets buried in the earth, waiting for dusk to rise again. The Mediterranean sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows across the garden. But a restless unease clung to Isabelle Laurent like dew on the roses. She stood at the villa's edge, the silk scarf tucked into her pocket. Its embroidered words, "You are always home." A quiet pulse against her fingertips. The photo she'd found last night haunted her. Claire, her sister, cradling a baby with Sophie's eyes. The image churned questions she wasn't ready to ask, not yet. But the garden below, with its lavender and wild blooms, seemed to hold secrets older than her own. Sophie was there again, her hands buried in the earth, tending a patch of daisies with a care that felt almost sacred. Isabelle watched her, caught between curiosity and suspicion. The bracelet, the photo, Eleanor's vague answers, they wove a thread she couldn't unravel. She wanted to confront her mother, to demand the truth, but something held her back. Fear, perhaps, or the fragile hope that Eleanor's forgiveness might still be hers to earn. Inside the cottage, Eleanor was peeling apples, her movements slow but deliberate, as if time could be persuaded by patience. Isabelle hesitated at the door, the scarf heavy in her hand. "You've kept this place alive," she said, gesturing to the garden beyond. "It's more beautiful than I remember." Eleanor's eyes crinkled, a spark of warmth breaking through. "It's the roots," she said. "They hold fast even when the storms come." The words felt like a mirror, reflecting Isabelle's own uprooted life. She sat, searching for a way to bridge the years. "I didn't mean to stay away so long," she said, her voice softer now. "After Claire, after everything, I thought leaving was the only way." Eleanor's hand stilled, the knife glinting in the sunlight. "You did what you thought you had to," she said, but there was a tremor in her voice, a crack in her calm. "Claire understood that even if I didn't." Claire. The name hung between them, sharp as broken glass. Isabelle's throat tightened. Memories of her sister flooding back. Claire's laughter, her quiet strength, her death in a car accident that Isabelle had learned about too late, from a clipped voicemail. She'd been in Paris, drowning in deadlines, too proud to return for the funeral. The guilt had festered ever since, a wound she'd dressed in silk and success. Before she could speak, the door swung open, and Sophie stepped in, her cheeks flushed from the sun. "The daisies are blooming," she said, then paused, sensing the tension. "Everything okay?" Eleanor nodded, but Isabelle's gaze locked on Sophie, searching for traces of Claire in her features. "You're good with the garden," she said, forcing a smile. "Ever thought of doing more with it?" Sophie shrugged, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's enough for me. Eleanor says it's like family. You care for it, and it grows." The words stung, though Isabelle couldn't say why. She stood, needing air, and gestured to the garden. "Show me," she said. "I could use a lesson." They walked to the flower beds, the sea's murmur a steady undertow. Sophie handed Isabelle a trowel, her movements brisk but not unkind. "Dig here," she said, pointing to a patch of soil. "Not too deep, just enough to let the roots breathe." Isabelle knelt, her silk blouse brushing the dirt. The trowel felt clumsy in her hands, a stark contrast to the pens and sketches of her Paris studio. She dug, her motions awkward, and Sophie's lips twitched, almost a smile. "You're not bad," Sophie said, "for a city girl." The teasing caught Isabelle off guard, and she laughed, the sound startlingly free. For a moment, the garden held them. No past, no secrets, just earth and sunlight. But the ease shattered when a car rolled up the villa's drive, its sleek black frame out of place against the roses. Isabelle's stomach dropped. She knew that car. Antoine Dubois stepped out, his tailored coat pristine, his smile sharp as a blade. "Isabelle," he called, striding toward her. "I heard you were hiding in paradise. Thought I'd see for myself." She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, her pulse quickening. "Antoine," she said, her voice cool, "what brings you?" "To the coast?" His eyes gleamed, predatory. "Curiosity," he said, glancing at Sophie, then back to Isabelle. "Paris is buzzing. They say you're running from something, or someone." The words were a barb, laced with the old rivalry that had festered since Milan. Isabel's jaw tightened. "I'm here for my mother," she said, each word deliberate. "Nothing more." Antoine's smile didn't waver. "Of course," he said, his gaze lingering on the scarf peeking from her pocket. "But family has a way of complicating things, doesn't it? I'd hate for your past to catch up with you." He left as quickly as he'd come, his car vanishing down the drive. But the threat hung in the air, heavy as storm clouds. Sophie watched him go, her expression guarded. "Friend of yours?" she asked. "Hardly," Isabel muttered, her mind racing. Antoine knew something, or he wanted her to think he did. Her absence from Paris was blood in the water, and he was circling. Back in the cottage, Eleanor was silent, her eyes fixed on the sea. Isabel wanted to ask about Sophie, about Claire, about the photo, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she pulled the scarf from her pocket, its stitches catching the light. "You kept this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All these years." Eleanor looked at her, her gaze steady, but soft. "It was never mine to let go," she said. The answer felt like a door, half open, leading somewhere Isabel wasn't ready to go. But as she stepped into the garden, the roses trembling under the midday sun, she felt the weight of Sophie's bracelet, Claire's photo, and Antoine's words pressing closer. The truth was out there, buried in the earth, and it was only a matter of time before it bloomed. The sky over Côte d'Azur hung heavy with clouds, the sea beyond the cliffs churning restlessly, as if it sensed the storm brewing in Isabelle Laurent's heart. She stood in the garden, the silk scarf clutched in her fist, its embroidered words, "You are always home," mocking her with their promise. The roses swayed under the gathering wind, their petals trembling, and Isabel felt the same tremor in her chest. The photo she'd found, Claire holding a baby with Sophie's eyes, had burned itself into her mind, a question she could no longer ignore. Inside the cottage, Eleanor sat by the hearth, her hands folded over a quilt, her face etched with lines that spoke of years Isabel had missed. Sophie was out, tending the village market, leaving a quiet that felt both fragile and fraught. Isabel had spent the morning pacing the villa, Antoine Dubois' veiled threat echoing in her ears. "I'd hate for your past to catch up with you." He knew something. Or he was bluffing to unsettle her. Either way, Paris was a battlefield she wasn't ready to face, not when the truth about Sophie loomed closer with every glance. "Eleanor," Isabel began, her voice unsteady as she sat across from her mother. "Who is Sophie? Really?" Eleanor's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing their steady gaze. She reached for her tea, the cup trembling slightly in her hands. "I told you," she said, her voice low. "She's been with me a while. A girl who needed a home." The answer was too careful, too rehearsed. Isabel leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "She wears Claire's bracelet," she said, the words sharp, almost an accusation. "And that photo. Claire with a baby. It's her, isn't it? Sophie?" Eleanor's cup clattered against the saucer, the sound slicing through the silence. For a moment she looked older, smaller, as if the weight of years pressed her into the chair. "Isabel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You weren't here." The words hit like a slap, raw and unyielding. Isabel's breath caught guilt and anger tangling in her throat. "I know I wasn't," she said, her voice breaking. "But I'm here now, and I need the truth. Is she Claire's?" Eleanor's gaze dropped to the quilt, her fingers tracing its faded stitches. "Yes," she said finally, the word heavy with surrender. "Sophie is Claire's daughter, your niece." The room seemed to tilt, the air thinning around Isabel. She gripped the scarf, its softness anchoring her as the truth crashed through her defenses. Sophie, her niece, Claire's child raised by Eleanor while Isabel chased runways and headlines. She saw Claire's face again, her sister's smile fading in that last phone call, begging her to come home after their father's death. Isabel had hung up, too consumed by Paris, too afraid of grief. And now Claire was gone and Sophie was here, a living echo of everything she'd lost. "Why didn't you tell me?" Isabel asked, her voice raw, tears stinging her eyes. All these years, why didn't you say anything? Eleanor looked up, her eyes glistening but resolute. You were gone, Isabel. After Claire died, I tried reaching you. Letters, calls. You never answered. Sophie was a baby, alone. I couldn't wait for you to decide to care. The accusation landed like a stone, crushing the last of Isabel's pride. She remembered those years, drowning in sketches, parties, the relentless, climbed to the top. She'd ignored Eleanor's letters, deleted her voicemails, telling herself there was time. There wasn't. Claire's accident had come and gone, and Isabel had learned of it from a news clipping, too late to mourn, too proud to return. I didn't know, she whispered, but the words felt hollow, a plea to no one. I didn't know she had a daughter. Eleanor's hand reached across the table, tentative, then firm. You can know her now, she said, her voice softer but unyielding. If you choose to stay. The door creaked open, and Sophie stepped in, a basket of market vegetables in her arms. She froze, sensing the weight in the room. What's wrong? She asked, her eyes darting between them. Isabel stood, her legs unsteady, the scarf slipping to the floor. She wanted to speak, to tell Sophie she knew, but the words choked her. Instead, she fled to the garden, the roses blurring through her, tears. The sea roared beyond, its rhythm a counterpoint to her racing heart. She sank onto a stone bench, the scarf in her lap, and let the memories come. Claire teaching her to braid flowers, Claire's voice cracking as she begged Isabel not to leave. She'd failed her sister, failed Eleanor, failed a child she hadn't known existed. The guilt was a tide, pulling her under, and she didn't fight it. Her phone buzzed, a harsh intrusion. A message from her assistant. Antoine's team leaked. A story. Claims you abandoned family for fame. Press is circling. Need you in Paris. Isabel's hands shook as she read it. Antoine wasn't bluffing. He dug into her past, and now the world would know her shame. Not just as a designer, but as a daughter, a sister. She looked up to see Sophie approaching, a paint can in one hand, a brush in the other. The fence needs touching up, Sophie said, her tone cautious but kind. Want to help? Isabel blinked, the offer a lifeline she didn't deserve. She nodded, taking the brush, and they worked side by side, the white paint streaking the weathered wood. Isabel's strokes were uneven, her hands unpracticed, but Sophie didn't correct her. For a moment, the garden held them, two women bound by silence and sunlight, painting over cracks that ran deeper than wood. As they finished, Sophie's sleeve slipped, revealing Claire's bracelet again. Isabel's heart lurched. She'd be proud of you, she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Claire, I mean. Sophie's eyes widened, then softened, but she said nothing, turning back to the fence. Isabel clutched, the scarf, its stitches a map to a truth she was only beginning to understand. Antoine's threat loomed, Paris called. But here in the garden she felt the first stirrings of something she'd forgotten. Family, fragile and fierce, waiting for her to choose it. Rain lashed the windows of Isabelle Laurent's Paris penthouse. The city's lights blurred into streaks of gold and gray. She stood by the glass, the silk scarf, "You are always home," draped over her shoulders, its weight both comfort and accusation. The truth about Sophie, her niece, Claire's daughter, had cracked something inside her, a fault line running through the empire she'd built. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. You can know her now, if you choose to stay. But staying meant facing a past she'd spent 20 years outrunning, and now, Paris was calling her back to fight. The headlines had erupted overnight. Antoine Dubois' handiwork splashed across every fashion blog and tabloid. Isabelle Laurent, Queen of Couture, abandoned family for fame. The articles twisted her absence into betrayal, painting her as a heartless mogul who'd left her grieving mother and sister to chase glory. Isabel's fingers tightened around her phone, Antoine's smug face flashing in her memory. He'd been circling since Milan, waiting for her to stumble. Now, with her in Côte d'Azur in Paris whispering, He'd struck. Her assistant's voicemail played on repeat. The press is relentless. Antoine's pushing for a public showdown at the gala tomorrow. You need to be here. Isabel's jaw clenched. She could stay in the villa, hide with Eleanor and Sophie, let the garden shield her from the world. But Antoine wouldn't stop, and her empire, her name, was at stake. She'd fought too hard to let him unravel it. Yet the thought of leaving Eleanor, so fragile, and Sophie, so guarded, tore at her. For the first time, Paris felt like a cage, not a crown. She booked a flight, the decision heavy as she packed. The scarf went into her bag, its stitches a reminder of the family she'd only just begun to reclaim. At the airport, her phone buzzed again, a text from Sophie. Eleanor's not well. She's asking for you. Isabel froze, her boarding pass trembling in her hand. The words were a knife slicing through her resolve. She called the villa, Sophie's voice crackling through the line. "It's her heart," Sophie said, her tone steady but strained. "The doctor's here, but she's weak. She keeps saying your name." Isabel's throat closed. She saw Eleanor's face, those sharp eyes softened by time, and Claire's lost forever. She'd failed her sister once, left her to die alone. She couldn't fail Eleanor too, not again. "I'm coming," she said, the words a vow. She canceled the flight, rented a car, and drove through the rain-soaked night, the scarf on the passenger seat like a talisman. The cottage was quiet when she arrived, the garden shrouded in mist. Sophie met her at the door, her eyes red but fierce. "She's resting," she whispered, leading Isabel inside. Eleanor lay in bed, her breathing shallow, an oxygen mask fogging with each exhale. Isabel sank beside her, taking her mother's hand, its warmth a fragile thread. "I'm here," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm not leaving." Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, a faint smile curving her lips. "Good," she murmured, her fingers squeezing weakly. "Stay." The doctor warned it was touch and go. Eleanor's heart was failing faster than expected. Isabel's world narrowed to the cottage, to the rhythm of her mother's breath. But Paris wouldn't wait. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, texts, emails, headlines piling up. Antoine had escalated, leaking old photos of Isabel at galas while Claire's obituary ran in small print, framing her as cold, untouchable. The board was panicking, her investors wavering. She needed to fight, to reclaim her name. She drove to Paris at dawn, the scarf around her neck, her resolve steeled. The gala was a glittering fortress, chandeliers casting light over silk gowns and sharp smiles. Antoine stood at its heart, his voice smooth as he addressed the crowd, each word a dart aimed at her. "Isabelle Laurent built an empire," he said, "but at what cost? Family, loyalty, sacrificed for fame." Isabel stepped forward, the room hushing as eyes turned to her. Her heart pounded, but she thought of Eleanor, of Sophie, of Claire's bracelet glinting in the sun. "Antoine speaks of costs," she said, her voice clear, cutting through the murmurs. "But he doesn't know mine. I left my family, yes. I chose ambition over love. But I'm here to face that, not to hide." The crowd stirred, some nodding, others skeptical. Antoine's smile faltered, but he pressed on. "Words," he said. "Easy to say, harder to prove." Isabel's gaze didn't waver. "Then watch me," she said. She turned to leave, her heels echoing in the silence. Outside, the rain had stopped, the city gleaming under a fragile moon. She'd lost ground tonight. Her board would meet tomorrow, her contracts teetering, but she'd gained something else, something Antoine couldn't touch. Back at the villa, Sophie was waiting, a lantern glowing in the garden. "You came back," she said, her voice soft, almost disbelieving. Isabel nodded, pulling the scarf tighter. "I told you I would." They walked to the cottage where Eleanor slept, her breathing steadier now. Isabel sat by her mother, her hand brushing Sophie's as they watched in silence. The garden outside was dark, but the roses held fast, their roots deep in the earth. Her phone buzzed. A new headline, Laurent defiant, but questions linger. Antoine wasn't done, and Paris wouldn't forgive easily. But Isabelle felt a shift inside her, a clarity born of loss and love. She'd fought for her name once, built a kingdom from it. Now she'd fight for something more. For Eleanor, for Sophie, for the family she'd almost lost again. The scarf lay warm against her skin, its promise no longer a weight, but a guide, leading her home. The dawn broke gently over Côte d'Azur, bathing the garden in a soft, rosy light that seemed to promise mercy. Isabelle Laurent sat by Eleanor's bedside, the silk scarf folded in her lap, its embroidered words, "You are always home," a quiet vow against the sterile hum of the oxygen machine. Eleanor's breathing was steadier now, but the doctor's words lingered like a shadow, her heart's weak. Days, maybe weeks. Isabelle's fingers traced the scarf's stitches, each one a tether to the mother she'd almost lost again. Sophie stood at the cottage window, her silhouette framed by the lavender beyond. She'd barely spoken since Isabelle's return from Paris, her eyes carrying a wariness that cut deeper than words. Isabelle wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap widened by years of absence, but Sophie's guarded glances reminded her of Claire, fierce, fragile, unforgiving. The truth that Sophie was her niece, Claire's daughter, had shattered Isabelle's defenses, but it hadn't yet built trust. Outside, the garden waited, its roses and daisies defiant under the morning dew. Isabelle rose, needing its grounding. Earth. "I'm going for a walk," she said softly, glancing at Sophie. "Join me?" Sophie hesitated, then nodded, pulling on a sweater. They stepped into the garden, the air cool and sharp with salt. Isabelle's heels sank into the soil, and she kicked them off, the grass cool against her bare feet. Sophie raised an eyebrow but said nothing, leading the way to a bench beneath a trellis of climbing roses. "You've been here for her," Isabelle said, breaking the silence. "For Eleanor. I should have been too." Sophie's hands tightened in her lap, her silver bracelet, Claire's bracelet, catching the light. "You weren't," she said, her voice low, not cruel but honest. "She waited, you know. For years. But she never stopped loving you." The words pierced Isabelle, a blade honed by truth. She thought of Eleanor's letters, unopened in her Paris desk, and Claire's voicemails deleted in a haze of ambition. "I didn't know about you," she said, her voice cracking. "If I had, would it have changed anything?" Sophie cut in, her eyes meeting Isabelle's, sharp and searching. "You left them both. Claire told me stories about you, how you'd braid flowers, how you'd dream of Paris. She wanted you to come back. You didn't." Isabelle's chest ached, memories of Claire flooding back, her sister's laughter, her quiet pleas, her death Isabelle had learned of too late. "I was wrong," she said, tears spilling over. "I was scared, of failing, of feeling. I thought Paris would fix me. It didn't." Sophie looked away, her jaw tight, but her shoulders softened, just enough to give Isabelle hope. They sat, in silence, the garden's hum filling the space between them. Isabelle pulled a small book from her bag, a children's story Claire had loved, one they'd read together as girls. "I found this in the cottage," she said, her voice trembling. "Want to read it with me?" Sophie's eyes widened, then softened, a flicker of curiosity breaking through. She took the book, her fingers brushing Isabelle's, and began to read, her voice steady but warm. "The little rabbit ran through the meadow." The words wove, a fragile bridge, carrying them back to a time before grief, before distance. Isabelle listened, her tears falling silently, the scarf warm against her skin. They finished the story as the sun climbed higher, the garden glowing around them. Sophie closed the book, her gaze distant. "Claire read this to me," she said almost to herself. Before everything." Isabelle reached out, tentative, and squeezed Sophie's hand. "She'd be so proud of you," she said, echoing words she'd spoken before, but this time they held weight, a promise. Sophie didn't pull away, but her eyes held a question, unspoken but heavy. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come back now?" Before Isabel could answer, her phone buzzed, shattering the moment. A voicemail from her assistant. "Antoine's at it again. He's got a source claiming you knew about Claire's child and ignored her. He's pushing for a press conference tomorrow." Isabel's stomach dropped. Antoine wasn't just attacking her name. He was digging into her shame, weaponizing her past. She stood, pacing the garden, the scarf slipping to the bench. Sophie watched, her expression unreadable. "Trouble in Paris?" she asked, her tone neutral but edged with curiosity. "An old rival," Isabel said, forcing calm. "He wants to ruin me. He thinks he can use us." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "Let him try," she said, a spark of defiance in her voice. "Eleanor taught me. Storms come, but roots hold." The words echoed Eleanor's, grounding Isabel in a way she hadn't expected. She picked up the scarf, its stitches catching the light, and made a choice. "I'm not going back," she said, more to herself than Sophie. "Not yet. Eleanor needs me. You need me." Sophie's lips parted, but before she could speak, a car pulled up. The doctor's, his face grim as he hurried to the cottage. Isabel's heart lurched. She and Sophie ran inside, finding Eleanor awake but pale, her hand clutching a small notebook. "For you," she whispered to Isabel, her voice faint. "Claire's." Isabel took it, her hands trembling. The notebook was worn, its pages filled with Claire's handwriting, letters to Sophie, dreams for her future, and a final note: "Tell Isabel I forgive her. She's still my sister." Tears blurred Isabel's vision as she read, Sophie's presence beside her a quiet anchor. Antoine's threat loomed, a storm gathering strength, but in the cottage, with Eleanor's breath steadying and Sophie's hand brushing hers, Isabel felt something shift. Paris could wait. Her empire could crumble. But this, her mother, her niece, the garden, was worth fighting for. The scarf lay across her lap, its promise no longer a dream, but a truth she was finally ready to claim. The moon hung low over Côte d'Azur, its silver light spilling across the garden, where roses glowed like embers against the night. Isabelle Laurent stood at the villa's terrace, the silk scarf, "You are always home," knotted loosely around her neck, its stitches a lifeline through the storm she knew was coming. Eleanor's condition had stabilized, but her fragility lingered, a quiet reminder of time slipping away. Sophie's trust, hard won through shared stories and garden silences, was a fragile bridge Isabel vowed not to break. But Paris had not forgotten her, and neither had Antoine Dubois. The town's annual festival glittered below, a tapestry of lanterns and music winding through the streets. Isabel had agreed to speak, a gesture to honor Eleanor's love for the community, but the invitation carried a sharper edge. Antoine had arrived, his presence announced by a flurry of texts from her assistant. "He's at the festival. Press is with him. He's got something big." Isabel's pulse quickened. She'd ignored his threats too long, and now he'd brought the battlefield to her doorstep. She dressed simply, white silk blouse, dark trousers, the scarf her only adornment, and drove to the festival, the garden fading in her rearview mirror. The square was alive with vendors and dancers, children laughing under strings of lights. But Isabel's eyes found Antoine at once. He stood by the stage, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the crowd, his smile sharp as ever. Beside him, reporters hovered, cameras glinting like predators' eyes. "Isabel," he called as she approached, his voice smooth but venomous. "You've kept us waiting." She met his gaze, her chin lifting. "I'm here now," she said, her tone steady despite the churn in her stomach. "What do you want, Antoine?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice for her alone. "The truth," he said. "About you, your sister, your niece. I have proof, letters, records. You knew about Claire's child and turned your back. Paris deserves to know who you really are." The words were a blade, slicing through her resolve. Isabel's hand brushed the scarf, grounding her. She thought of Claire's notebook, its final plea. Tell Isabel I forgive her. Antoine's proof was a lie, twisted to wound, but the crowd was watching and the cameras were rolling. She could deny it, fight him in court, save her empire. Or she could choose another path. The festival host called her to the stage, the spotlight harsh against the velvet night. Isabel climbed the steps, her heart pounding, the scarf soft against her skin. The crowd hushed, their faces a sea of curiosity and judgment. Antoine stood below, arms crossed, waiting for her to falter. I came here tonight to honor my mother, Isabel began, her voice clear, carrying over the square. Eleanor Laurent, who taught me that home is not a place but a promise. I broke that promise once. I left her, left my sister Claire, to build a life in Paris. I thought success would fill the emptiness. It didn't. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Isabel pressed on, her eyes finding Sophie's in the front row, her niece's bracelet gleaming under the lanterns. Claire had a daughter, she said, her voice trembling but strong. Sophie, who stands here tonight, my niece. I didn't know her until now, because I was too proud, too lost to come home. But I'm here to claim her, to love her, as Claire would have wanted. The crowd gasped, cameras flashing, but Isabel's gaze held Sophie's unwavering. Antoine stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din. Pretty words, he sneered, holding up a recorder. But listen to this. Isabel 10 years ago saying she'd never return. That family was a burden. He pressed play, and her voice echoed, cold and clipped. I don't need them. Paris is enough. The crowd stirred, whispers turning to murmurs, but Sophie moved before Isabel could speak. She climbed the stage, her eyes blazing, and took the microphone. She came back, Sophie said, her voice ringing out, steady and fierce. She's here now, for Eleanor, for me. That's what matters. You don't get to judge her, not when she's trying. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others shouting, but Sophie's words were a shield, wrapping Isabel in a warmth she hadn't earned. She reached for Sophie's hand, squeezing it, and faced Antoine. You want my past? She said, her voice rising. Take it. I'm done hiding. I'm selling my stake in the company, stepping back. My family comes first. Antoine's smile vanished, his recorder useless now. The cameras turned on him, his plan unraveling under the moon's unforgiving light. Isabel stepped down, Sophie beside her, the scarf catching the breeze like a flag of surrender and strength. They returned to the villa, the festival's music fading behind them. In the garden, under the trellis of roses, Sophie paused, her breath visible in the cool air. You didn't have to do that, she said, her voice soft. Give it all up. Isabel smiled, tying the scarf around Sophie's shoulders, its stitches glowing faintly. I didn't give up anything, she said. I gained everything. They sat on the bench, the garden quiet around them, and Isabel felt Claire's presence. Not a ghost, but a warmth, a forgiveness woven into the earth. Eleanor was waiting inside, her strength returning, and for the first time, Isabel believed in tomorrows. Antoine's threats were empty now, his power broken by a truth stronger than lies. The roses swayed, their petals falling like stars, and Isabel knew she was home, not just in the garden, but in the family she'd fought to reclaim. The summer. Sun-bathed Côte d'Azur in a golden haze, its warmth coaxing the garden into a riot of color. Lavender swaying, roses unfurling, daisies nodding like old friends. Isabel Laurent stood at the garden's heart, the silk scarf. You are always home, tied loosely at her wrist, its stitches no longer a weight but a promise kept. Months had passed since the festival, since she'd stood under the moon and claimed Sophie as family, since she'd walked away from Paris to rebuild what she'd broken. The roses had bloomed again, and so had she. Eleanor sat on a bench nearby, her silver hair catching the light, her strength returning like the tide. The doctors called it a miracle, but Isabel knew better. It was love, stubborn and fierce, that had pulled her mother through. Sophie knelt beside a new flower bed, her hands deft as she planted marigolds, her laughter mingling with the hum of bees. The garden was theirs now, a shared sanctuary. But today it was more, a gift to the village, open to children who needed a place to dream. Isabel had sold her company, the headlines fading into silence as Paris moved on to new scandals. The money had funded a Kwai Hak Bong in Claire's name, offering art classes and music lessons to kids across the coast. She'd named it Claire's Light, a tribute to the sister she'd lost, whose forgiveness had guided her home. The first students would arrive tomorrow, their laughter destined to fill the garden, just as Claire would have wanted. "Isabel," Eleanor called, her voice steady now, warm with pride. "Come sit. You've been fussing all morning." Isabel smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. She wore linen now, not silk, her Paris polish traded for something softer, truer. She joined Eleanor, their shoulders touching, the bench creaking under shared weight. "I want it to be perfect," she said, gesturing to the garden. "For them. For us." Eleanor's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "It already is," she said, her eyes tracing the blooms. "You made it so." Sophie stood, wiping her brow, and jogged over, a marigold tucked behind her ear. "You're worse than me," she teased, nudging Isabel. "Relax, Aunt Isabel. The kids'll love it." Aunt Isabel. The title still caught her off guard, a gift she hadn't earned, but cherished fiercely. She laughed, the sound free, unburdened. "I'll try," she said, ruffling Sophie's hair, earning a playful scowl. The day unfolded like a melody, simple but profound. They worked together, hanging lanterns for the opening, stringing fairy lights through the trellis. Isabel caught, Sophie sketching the garden, her pencil capturing the roses with Claire's precision, and her heart swelled. Eleanor shared stories of Claire, her love for painting, her stubborn hope, and Isabel listened, no longer shying from the pain, but embracing it, letting it heal. As dusk settled, they gathered in the garden for dinner, a wooden table set under the stars. Bread, olives, and wine passed between them, the sea's murmur a gentle backdrop. Isabel raised her glass, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "To Claire," she said, "who brought us here. And to us, for finding each other again." Eleanor's eyes glistened, her glass trembling. "To family," she added, her voice a vow. Sophie clinked her glass, her smile bright but thoughtful. "To roots," she said, glancing at the garden. "They hold no matter what." They ate, laughed, and lingered, the lanterns casting a warm glow over their faces. Isabel felt Claire's presence, not a ghost, but a thread woven into every bloom, every smile. She thought of Paris, its runways and rivalries, and realized she missed none of it. The empire she'd built had been a fortress, not a home. This, Eleanor's hand in hers, Sophie's laughter, was enough. After dinner, Sophie pulled out a small box, her cheeks flushed. "I made this," she said, handing it to Isabel. Inside was a woven bracelet, braided with threads from the scarf, tiny beads spelling home. "So you don't forget," Sophie said, her voice soft. Isabel's throat tightened, tears welling, as she slipped it on. "Never," she promised, pulling Sophie into a hug, Eleanor joining them, their arms a circle unbroken by time. They cleared the table, the night deepening around them, and Isabel paused by the trellis, the scarf's remnant fluttering at her wrist. She remembered the woman she'd been, cold, driven, afraid, and marveled at the one she'd become. The garden had changed her, its roots sinking deep, teaching her what Paris never could. Love was not a prize to win, but a gift to tend. The next day, children would come, their voices filling the air, and Claire's Kwai Hak Bong would carry her spirit forward. But tonight, it was just them, 3 women bound by loss and love standing in a garden reborn. Isabel looked at Eleanor, at Sophie, and saw home, not in the villa's grandeur or Paris's lights, but in their faces, their hands, their laughter, under the moon. She hung the scarf on the trellis, its stitches catching the starlight, a beacon for anyone who'd lost their way. The roses swayed, the sea sang, and Isabel breathed deeply, her heart full at last. She was home, not just for now, but forever. Thank you for walking this path with Isabel, Eleanor, and Sophie. Has their story touched your heart?